Linguistics, help promote justice for all. You can read the slides for yourself. These are the points that I hope to cover today. And in moving forward, I know that not everyone here is a linguist, but I'm going to give my quick elevator definition of what linguistics is. Linguistics is the science that tries to determine what all human languages have in common. And in red letters, you're seeing what is linguistics written in phonetic transcription. If you don't know what phonetic transcription is, it's an alphabet that allows us to write down any verbal utterance. So you don't need to know the language in order to be able to write it down. And linguists for many years have written alphabets for previously unwritten languages using this. Very interestingly, linguistics departments, depending upon where you find them, and they're not at every university. My main appointment is in a psychology department that changed its name to Psychological and Brain Sciences because we have a neuroscience psychology program, philosophy, neuroscience, and psychology program that was gaining such popularity that the psychology department felt it needed to rebrand itself. So it reminded people that they were a brain science in addition to just being psychology. It did not increase our enrollments, but it was a feel-good moment on the faculty when we voted in favor of that. As a linguist in the psychological and brain sciences department, I have constant Rodney Dangerfield moments where I feel like my science doesn't get adequate respect. I studied at the University of Pennsylvania where Noam Chomsky got his PhD, and I actually studied syntax with Chomsky's professor Zelig Harris, who's the most brilliant person I've ever met in the face of my life. And I remember on many occasions Professor Harris saying, psychologists, what are they? They call that a science, you know? And again, then he would drag us back to linguistics, which was a real science. But at many universities, linguistics departments are housed in humanities. Where are you guys housed here? Humanities, right? See, so, you know, Stanford too, right? But University of Arizona, it's in the social sciences. At my university, it's only a program. So linguists, as president of the Linguistic Society of America, I'm trying to think of ways that we can grow. And the social justice initiative, I understand, is looking for partners. And so I'll be trying to talk to my linguistic colleagues to see if there's some growth potential in the future because linguists, we're an endangered species regardless of specialty. And for example, not one of the historically black colleges or universities has a linguistics department. I'm trying through my work as president of the Linguistic Society to see if Howard University and my friends at the Ford Foundation might consider creating a fledgling borrowed faculty linguistics department at Howard University as a start, and then getting a toehold because, for heaven's sakes, for the historically black colleges and universities not to have any linguistics programs or departments is a truly missing disciplinary entity, right? So the fact that you have an outstanding linguistics department here is important, and I'm going to come back to that momentarily. But for now, in the aftermath of what we've seen happen to the issues surrounding critical race theory, I want to begin by having you look at this editorial cartoon, which I was at a point in my career when the floods of Katrina hit, and I was asked to write a paper in the aftermath of Katrina, trying to connect somehow linguistic issues to Katrina, and it was a stretch for me. But this was the introduction to the paper, this editorial cartoon. So I didn't write anything other than provide this introduction. But I'm going to come back to this photo. I want you to think about this image and how you might refer to the people that are below the waterline without referring to their race. Okay? I mean, you can clearly see racial differences between the two? Is there a way to think about or characterize the people below the waterline without referring to their race? We're going to come back to that, okay? But this will give you a chance to So the work on linguistic profiling, we're going to look at that initially in historical perspective. First, the word shibboleth. It's used in cultural context now to talk about in-groups and out-groups. And then there's a scene from West Side Story that's relevant. But the linguistic profiling that I discovered results from the criminalization of phone calls. And it turns out that the National Fair Housing Alliance produced this public service announcement at the very same time that I was conducting experiments looking at voice discrimination in the housing market. And at the time that this work began, the courts were ill-equipped to address how best to challenge accusations of racial discrimination by phone. They were fine with face-to-face cases, and the underlying assumption was that racial discrimination would be based on visual identification. The idea that you could have auditory identification was something that the courts did not treat with any seriousness or regularity. But I didn't come up with this, okay? The origin of the word shibboleth is from the Bible, Old Testament, Book of Judges. And it was used as a means through which the Galeadites and the Ephraimites could tell one another apart. If you think about this in any depth, you realize that their appearance had to be the same, their dress had to be almost identical. There were no visual cues that separated the groups, right? What separated the groups was their ability to either pronounce the word shibboleth, or if they couldn't and they said sibboleth, 42,000 of them were killed, right? So in biblical times, shibboleths were in fact lethal. I've got to figure out with the right mic because the next one was when I was 10 years old, the very issue that I studied came up in a movie.
Lots of new housing with more space.
Lots of doors slamming in our face.
I'll get a terrace apartment.
Better get rid of your accent.
Really? Okay. I mean, maybe I had some subliminal memory of that. But the fact of the matter is, by the time I started to conduct my experiments, the situation looked quite different. So for those of you that are familiar with the Palo Alto Bay Area, I was invited in 1987 to spend a year at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences. I had initially thought that I would live in Palo Alto throughout the week and go visit my wife and kids on the weekends, who were staying in Los Angeles with my parents, who at that point were empty nesters in a large house in the suburbs. I missed them so much, and we missed each other, that we decided we wanted to be together in Palo Alto. So I started to call around for different apartments, and in nearly every instance I was told, please come see the place in person. On a few occasions when I showed up in person, I was told that something was wrong, there was a mistake, the apartment wasn't available. No one ever said to me, "Oh, I am so sorry. Had you sounded like an African American over the telephone, I would have never given you an appointment." That never happened. There was always another excuse. But I grew up in Los Angeles in the inner city, and I didn't always talk like a professor like I do now, you understand? So I could modify my speech, I could do an experiment. The experiment always had the phrase, "Hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper." But I could modify my speech and say, "Hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper." And because there's many of my neighbors were Latinx, I could call and say, "Hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper." Thank you very much. Okay, open mic night at the experiments. But East Palo Alto and Oakland and San Francisco were the majority minority communities. And Palo Alto and Woodside are the affluent communities in Silicon Valley. And as you can see from these results, the more affluent the community, the less likely that the minority dialect renditions were likely to get an appointment, right? So armed with this type of evidence, it turns out that the Ad Council came up with a great idea to try to prove that this was an issue.
Hello. Yes. Can I ask a few questions about the apartment on Park Street?
What was your name?
My name is Juan Hernandez.
It's been rented.
Oh, it's gone. Hello, my name is Sanjay Kumar. I am calling about the apartment on Park Street.
It's not available.
Not available? Hello, my name is Tyrone Washington. I'm calling about the apartment on Park Street.
Just been rented.
Hello, I am Chen Ling. My name is Khalid bin Ali. I'm Tuan Vo. Hello, my name is Moshe Goldberg. I use a wheelchair. It's gone. Not available. All right. Thank you. Yes, hello, my name is Graham Wellington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street. Is that still available?
Yes, it is.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Really?
Housing discrimination is illegal. If you think you've been a victim because of your race, color, national origin, sex, religion, disability, or family status, call us. Fair housing. It's not an option. It's the law.
So that commercial was very impactful, and people from a lot of different linguistic backgrounds began to explore the possibility that when they were declined applications or opportunities to see apartments, that it might be more than meets the eye. I'm going to shift gears now slightly and talk about the first murder case where linguistic evidence was used. And this was the case where the field of forensic linguistics was born. Roger Schy, a sociolinguist at Georgetown University, happened to be on a flight to Dallas, Texas, and he was sitting next to a gentleman that he thought was a minister working on his sermon. They struck up a conversation. The guy said, "No, I'm a lawyer. What do you do?" Roger said, "Oh, I'm a sociolinguist." The guy said, "What's that?" They exchanged business cards, and the man said, "You know, I have a friend that's working on a case that might be of interest." What's important about this case in many respects is that Cullen Davis, as a murder suspect, was the first high-profile murder suspect that was so wealthy. He was so wealthy that he had more resources to bring to the evaluation of his case than did the prosecution. And so his defense was really quite extraordinary, and the fact that he could hire a linguist was really quite exceptional. So what you're seeing here are pictures of Cullen Davis and his wife Priscilla. He was accused of attempted murder of her. They were separated. That's the mansion in which the attempted murder took place. He designed and built the mansion. He's from a wealthy oil and cattle family outside of Fort Worth. And you can see the painting of her on the right. So they had this exceedingly opulent lifestyle. But on the night in question, a masked man, completely masked, came in and attacked her. And she said that she recognized that it was her ex-husband, even though she couldn't see who it was. She said that she heard him and that she could also tell by the size of the body, the physical build, that it was him. So when they came to arrest him, they took him away. Many of the audience members who are African American are struck by the photo on the bottom left of him being arrested. Because if you're a black person, it jumps out at you right away. May not be the case. What do you see?
Not handcuffed.
He's not handcuffed. Okay? He's being arrested for murder. And they're okay with Cullen just driving down to the station. Okay? Even O.J. Simpson got handcuffed for a little bit before they let the handcuffs off of him, right? So it turns out that his famous attorney, Racehorse Haynes, is on the far right on the bottom. And Roger Schy had done a discourse analysis. I'm old enough that I saw the leaked evidence that implicated Cullen Davis, and I thought he was guilty. And for 20 years, I thought very, I lost respect for Roger because I thought he was just a hired gun who helped this guy get off. And I didn't understand the details of the case. Why? Because what was leaked that got shown to the rest of the public was a recording of Cullen Davis supposedly hiring the hitman. It's a long distance shot where you hear the voices of Cullen Davis and another man. Cullen Davis gets out of the car, walks around to the car, and the conversation is more or less, so you want him dead, right? And you want me to do this and, dispose of the bodies, and will I need an excuse? Will I need an alibi? Well, yeah, you're going to need it. I mean, it looked like it all fit together as slam dunk, he did it, right? But it turns out that there were two recordings. One was a long distance video, and the second was the guy who was supposedly the hired hitman, who's wired up like I am, who was sitting in the car. What Roger did was he did a discourse analysis of both recordings. The one that was leaked that made it look like there were implications where the guy did it, and then the one where Cullen Davis is getting out of the car, walking around to the trunk, and not hearing a person speaking in their regular tone of voice, trying to set him up. Why? Because the guy who is the informant for the police have other things on him. So he wants to cooperate. He wants to help them get this conviction. So when Roger Shai was on the stand, Cullen Davis asks the questions of him, well, you've come to your conclusion that my client probably didn't do it. And Roger Shai says, yes, I think that that's right. But he didn't present any evidence, right? Cullen Davis then sits down. The defense attorney gets up and says, Professor, you've claimed that you've come to these conclusions, but you haven't presented any evidence. At which point Roger says, but I have lots of evidence from my discourse analysis. Now, here's the beauty of this. Racehorse Haynes could have asked these questions himself. Please present your evidence. Had he done so, the prosecutor would have known how to attack it and tried to attack it through cross-examination. But as it was, playing in front of the jury, the fact that the prosecutor was the one that asked for the evidence made it look even more powerful that there might have been, some doubt as to whether or not Cullen Davis did it, and in fact he was acquitted, right? So that was the beginning of the field of forensic linguistics. Roger Shai has gone on to do a lot of things in that field. My work in this field has been much more accidental. So it's true, I started working on this stuff with housing discrimination, but based on that, and because of the fact that the housing discrimination work had racial implications, other court cases that came up that had racial relevance came to my attention. So even though I'm calling this, this is the second murder case that we're going to be considering, and I'm going to jump to the conclusion that not many people here have been arrested. If you are arrested, please know that all of the phone calls that you make will be recorded and can be used against you, okay? So they're allowed to do that. They do that. And on the case in question, it was a murder case where the black defendant was talking to his cousin, and the critical sentence on the wiretap was that the prosecutor claimed that he said the top sentence, I know I committed this shit, okay? Which was, he just admitted guilt. And the defense said, no, I think he actually said, I know I ain't committed this shit, okay? Now, this is rapid speech, black dialect, recorded in a jail setting, okay? So the difference is, and the overall context was his cousin said, well, hey, bro, he said, why don't you do a speedy trial? And he said, hey, bro, why am I do a speedy trial when I know I ain't committed this shit? Well, the prosecutor's transcript said, well, why would I want to have a speedy trial when I know I committed this shit? So by virtue of the fact that the prosecutor added all of these words that were not part of the, I was able to show the transcript is wrong here, it's wrong here, here, and here. And that raised some doubt, but that wasn't enough. So I didn't have access to the defendant himself, but I had the recordings. And so I conducted a series of experiments with other African American males about his same age using headphones in the lab to record, I know I committed this shit versus I know I ain't committed this shit at the same tempo, right? So they're listening to headphones, getting the cadence right. Different African American men are producing the utterance faithfully. Even if you've never looked at spectrographs before in your life, what you can see clearly is that the one on top, which is I know I committed this shit, and the one on the bottom, which is I know I ain't committed this shit, don't look exactly the same. If you look at the middle toward the bottom, notice the lighter area before the dark line, okay? The dark line that you're seeing right after the lighted area is the word committed. Up above, you're seeing kind of a dark line, but there's no lightness in front of it. That's because the vowel sound, which is elongated right before the consonant, doesn't have a drop in energy. The nasalized diphthong, the lightness that you see is the drop in energy. It's much easier to see than it is to hear. But by using the spectrographic analysis, we were able to show to the jury that not only were there errors in the transcript, but these utterances, which are quite similar, if you look at the bottom two lines of the red dots on the contour, you can see they're nearly identical in their parallel structure, right? So the difference is very slight. In this particular instance, guilt or innocence, life or death, boils down to whether or not a nasalized diphthong was part of the utterance, right? I was pleased and honored to be able to work on that case, and it's an instance where you can see that spectrographic analysis, an important tool in linguistic science, could be brought to bear in a beneficial way in this case, right? So the next case that I want to talk about is a horrific murder case. I'm going to tell you some facts about the case, the fact that public defenders were appointed, perceptions of racial bias, facts that were leading to an appeal, and then the difference between a fair trial and a perfect trial. So this is Mr. Robinson, who was accused of horrific murder in 1996. Mr. Robinson, by his own admission, is very active in gang activity. There's lots of pictures on him in social media with guns, money, drugs, bulletproof vests, gang paraphernalia. He lived in Baltimore. He had a girlfriend that lived in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Here in Brunswick, New Jersey, you guys know where all that stuff is. When I give this lecture in Seattle, I get this, where are they? Right? Okay. So the drive from Carlisle, Pennsylvania to Baltimore, maybe 2.5 hours, right? At any rate, this couple is dating off and on for a few years. The girlfriend in later years said that one of the things that she liked about the guy was that he was kind of exciting. She wasn't really enthralled with the criminal activity, but that there was a certain level of excitement. He had money and, just a way about him that, she found exhilarating, except when he would be, a little over the top, and she'd say, we need to call this off. And they were on again, off again for about 3 years. And from time to time, he would just drive up to Carlisle unannounced and show up. She admitted afterwards that the fact that on some of those occasions, not only did she let him in, but that they were intimate probably did little to dissuade him from coming back. At any rate, after a fairly long break, she met a new boyfriend. In the court cases, they pointed out that he was a church-going young man with a job and a bright future. And on the night in question, what had happened was she worked as a waitress at a restaurant, got off work around 10 o'clock. I forget exactly what job he had, but he picked her up after work, had a pizza. They were driving back to her apartment. They were going to hang out and have pizza, watch movies. And so they got back to her apartment, and the way that the apartment was situated was it was a two-story kind of condominium type complex, kitchen, living room, first floor, bathroom, bedrooms, upstairs. And so boyfriend had gone upstairs to take a shower. She was getting things ready for them to have their meal downstairs. When there's a knock on the door, Mr. Robinson shows up. She lets him in, and he says, "I need to talk to you." And she said, "I can't talk right now, I got company." And he said, "Well, I need to talk to you, so you need to tell him to go." And she said, "I'm not telling him to go, you need to go. You need to. So they have an argument. The argument escalates to the point where he pulls out a 9mm pistol, shoots her in the neck. She hits the floor. In his anger, he goes upstairs, puts 8 bullets in the new boyfriend taking a shower. That body is just slumped over. In his anger, he leaves, steps over her body, drives away. She's not dead. 45 minutes later, bleeding profusely, she drags herself to a neighbor's house. She's not able to talk, but she's able to write down who shot her. This is the kind of evidence prosecutors are like, we got our person, right? So Mr. Robinson is arrested, ends up in jail. He's indigent. He doesn't have a lot of money, so he gets a public defender. He got 2 attorneys working with him. He's working with those attorneys for a short period of time, and he's dissatisfied. So when he shows up in court, he asks the judge to give him new public defenders. Judge says, "No, you got to take the public defenders you've got." And the judge's word is the final word on that. He can't appeal that, he can't change that. So Mr. Robinson then made the fateful decision that he would then defend himself, which is his right, okay? He didn't have the education or background to do that, but when he did do that, he said some things, in all honesty, to the court that didn't help his cause. And so as part of his defense, he pointed out that he had not led a perfect life, but that when his life had encountered problems, most of those problems were the result of encounters with white people. And here he was on trial for his life with an all-white jury, a white judge, and a white prosecutor, and white public defenders. What chance did he have? Well, guess how that went over with the jury, right? So they convicted him, right? So he's convicted, he's waiting for his appeal. While he's waiting for his appeal, unrelated evidence comes to light about 3 to 4 months later, where the judge and the prosecutor had been using their workplace computers, using pseudonyms to exchange homophobic and racist emails and jokes, right? So they're sending pornographic pictures and racist jokes, and they get caught, right? They get caught by some reporter that reports this whole thing. Mr. Robinson says, wait a second, all of those emails and stuff were being exchanged at the same time that they were trying me. They're racist. There's no way I got a fair trial, right? And so that got turned over to another judge who then evaluated the trial. And what the judge said was that it was a fair trial that was imperfect. It was number 2, right? So all of us would want to have a fair trial that's perfect. That almost never happens, right? But the imperfections that might happen in a trial, we don't want that to result in something that's unfair. Number 3 is a contradiction. There's no such thing as an unfair trial that's perfect. And our worst nightmare is that the justice system gives us an imperfect trial that's also unfair. So what happened was, in the judge's ruling, it turns out that the prosecutor, in his closing, referred to Mr. Robinson as a big city guy who was disrespected, who had come back to Carlisle for revenge. Number 3 on here. I then conducted a survey with people. Now, also, Mr. Robinson, you saw his picture. The jury saw his picture. The judge was trying to say that because the prosecutor never explicitly said he was a black man, that no racial inferences should be drawn from the statement, He's a big city guy who said he was disrespected, right? So I took these different contrast conceptions, a welfare queen, a meth head, and a redneck, and added them to this, and then, had people write down, what are your impressions of these people? Okay, without the benefit of a photograph. And notice that in number 3, they assumed this was an African-American, late adolescence, okay, involved with gang activity. And that was just based on this sentence. So the judge's opinion that no one would draw racial inferences from this was in fact a testable hypothesis, which we did through the survey. And the survey results from the research showed that the vast majority of people thought that the person was African American and associated with gang activity. You'll notice that there is a significant number that think that the person's white. The correlation there is, excuse me, those who felt that the characterization referred to a white person thought it was like a Sopranos character. They thought it was a mafioso gangster type as opposed to an inner city gangster. So the main point of this is that there's probably a strong likelihood that Mr. Robinson did in fact commit that crime, but give him a fair trial, right? He made the mistake of defending himself. There's no need to pile on. There's enough evidence to prove his guilt in a fair trial. And our research showed that the judge seemed to put his thumb on the scale, and that wasn't necessary in this particular case. All right, coming back to this, I actually will take, if anybody's had a chance to think about this, anybody want to take a stab at how you might refer to the people below the waterline without referring to their race?
Unsafe.
Oh, that's good. I hadn't thought of that. See, one of the reasons I ask is because I already know what I have in mind. But yeah, being below the waterline is unsafe. If you're above the waterline, you're safe. If you're below the waterline, unsafe. Way to go. If I had a prize, you would get some of it. What I was going for was chances are there's a greater likelihood that the people below the waterline are the descendants of slaves. Okay? And even though you say the descendants of slaves is not an overt reference to race, it's an important thing to consider. Why? With the debates over affirmative action that we have right now, how one views black people when in fact there's a tremendous amount of diversity among the group is going to be quite different, right? So here are, famous people as well as the majority of the people that were in Katrina. Most of them are black. Nelson Mandela is not a black or African American, but Barack Obama and Nelson Mandela are not slave descendants. You'll remember that President Obama's mother was from Kansas, his father was from Kenya. Michelle Obama is a slave descendant, but Barack Obama is not, all right? And then Colin Powell's family's from the West Indies, so he's not a US slave descendant. Only Condoleezza Rice and the majority of the people from Katrina are in this category. And these issues are coming up as we wrestle with affirmative action. And so semanticists and other linguists can begin to help parse out some of these issues. In light of the time, I'm going to speed through some things. The power differentials that we're looking at in communication tie into some of the work that I did on whether or not we can use linguistics to help identify hostile work environments. And speech act theory is a very useful tool in that regard. So you have to have very special credentials in order to marry someone or arrest someone. If I told Carly that she was under arrest, it means nothing because I'm not a police officer. I can't do that, right? But if a police officer said that, Nicole was under arrest, then she'd say, why? I didn't do anything. All right, so you get the point. And yet, everybody in here is capable of making a promise, right? Every person can say, I promise to tell you the truth, and then it's up to you to live up to that promise. It doesn't require any official status, but arresting someone, marrying someone, hiring and firing, that depends on the position that you have. So the case in question, which looked at a hostile work environment, is it racist to call someone a monkey? Not necessarily. You can tell someone to stop that monkey business, don't throw a monkey wrench in it. You little monkeys are in real trouble, or, I mean, you can read this for yourself. I'm having trouble reading here, right? But in this particular case, the phrase, the job is so easy a monkey could do it, was critical. And we see from American culture that, the issues of monkeys within the culture a lot of times have absolutely nothing to do with race. But historically, there are many instances where caricatures depicting black people as monkeys is prevalent. I also included the crows from Disney's original Dumbo from this, because they absolutely were depicting black characters. And so the question came up. So what happened was there were a group of men, all of them in their 40s, who had been born in Africa. For all of them, English was their second language, and they spoke English with a very strong accent. And they worked for a company that fueled airplanes in Phoenix, Arizona. And the supervisor who oversaw this group was a younger white guy who had previously been one of their coworkers, but because the white guy had been born in the United States and was a native speaker of American English, he was perceived to be a better communicator. But on many occasions, he would refer to the black employees as monkeys. And you monkeys need to go fuel that plane, you monkeys need to do this or that. What he tried to say in his court case was that all he said was that the job was so easy a monkey could do it, and he built his defense on that. But as I weighed in as an expert witness as to whether or not referring to black people as monkeys was potentially racist, I had no shortage of evidence available on the internet, but it's not simply the case that it refers to black people. And in fact, the attorneys in the case really didn't want me to include these additional images that they felt diluted their case. Well, I'm not a gun for hire, and in anticipation of the possibility that someone would be called to challenge me, I certainly wanted to acknowledge in my report that evidence of this kind existed, right? But there's some evidence that comes into play, right? So you monkeys need to refuel the plane now. Is that racist? I'm not sure. Are the monkeys still on break? It's not looking good. But the ambiguous comment with inescapable relevance was the following. One day when the supervisor came in, one of the men was eating a lunch, made a soup that his wife made for him, and he said, "What is that shit you're eating? Monkey soup?" Okay, that's ambiguous. Either way, it's racist, right? So it was Phoenix, Arizona. First time around, it was a hung jury. Second time around, we eventually settled the case, and so they won. I'm going to zip through the rest of this because I've talked thus far about issues that have affected primarily African Americans. But the fact of the matter is that the linguistic landscape from the Atlantic to the Pacific from 1650 to the present has changed dramatically, largely as the result of European colonization. These indigenous languages have been pushed aside and reduced as immigrants from around the world have come to the United States. And we've looked at a situation where the freedom fighters who were protecting their land from the standpoint of the indigenous people were considered to be criminals from the standpoint of those who felt that America belonged to the European colonizers and their descendants. And so we see stereotypes played out in this regard.
Who are you guys?
You may not believe this, but my name is Granny Goose.
What's the vagus? Funny, eh?
My Granny Goose potato chips. Unusually good.
Interesting. Well seasoned. Provocative.
I make them for grown-ups. Now the only question is, are you grown up enough for a Granny Goose?
You remember the commercial, right? You're my age, right? I recognize the actors. Okay, see, you recognize the actors. Thank you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. Moving on fairly quickly, as we've witnessed increasing numbers of hate crimes against Asian Americans. You know, I'm a slave descendant, but I'm trying to get my head around what it must have felt like to be a Chinese American at the time that the Chinese Exclusion Act came into existence. Like, what? Oh, it's okay to have us build the railroads, and then, wait a minute, hold it. You know, let's put the brakes on these people, right? And at the time that Chinese laundries were happening in San Francisco, that was dangerous work, right? There were no washing machines back then. There were people that were suffering as a result of that. And so beyond that discrimination, we also have the fact that during World War II, the Japanese were interned against their will, lost their property, lost their rights, and their liberties were taken away from them until the end of that war. And yet they were viable, legitimate US citizens just like everybody else. So when we think about diversity within the United States, I was part of a group that made a documentary film called Do You Speak American? And it talks about the diversity of the country and our people.
How we talk to one another defines who we are.
Damn.
And American English is as rich, diverse, and lively as Americans themselves. From north to south.
I'm there 65 is where I started, okay?
East to west.
I say like and dude every other word.
Say A.
We love to talk.
Is there somebody else that I could talk to?
Yap.
Es acá.
Dish.
Tenemos el estreno de La Chica Sexy.
And chew the fat.
It's not a fur piece to rabbit hash.
It's clear that you are what you speak.
Isn't this not in my vocabulary? The word is ain't.
So butter my butt and call me a biscuit. And sit tight as we answer the burning question.
Do you speak American?
And so, as I call attention to your distinguished linguistic faculty, I want to emphasize that the diversity of languages that compose the citizenship of the United States are an underutilized resource. For years and years and years, immigrants to the United States have been engaged in what those in TESOL have referred to as subtractive bilingualism. They neglect the family heritage language and try to embrace English as quickly as they possibly can. But had we been wise enough to celebrate that linguistic diversity and encourage people to maintain their heritage languages and acquire English as a second language, we would have even greater linguistic resources available to us than we do today. The linguistics department here has been known for years as one of the premier departments to study theoretical formal linguistics. And as president of the Linguistic Society, I want to call attention to the fact that all of the discoveries that are made by basic linguistic researchers are tremendously useful to those of us that are working in the applied arena. Why? Because when these theoretical discoveries come forward, they often result in new methods and procedures that can in fact be adapted for some of the social purposes that I've described today. And so you're looking at a constellation of really remarkable linguists who were on your faculty. And last night at dinner, I think I coined a new phrase when I was talking to Adam about his research, because he was describing his new work in phonology to me. And I said, oh, you're doing non-binary phonology, right? So he said, I It's not what I call it, but that's an interesting way to think about it. And so from now on, I'm going to be talking about non-binary phonology and see how far I can take that. And so on that note, Rutgers, thank you very much.
Question about, you mentioned very briefly like affirmative action in like your work or in what you've researched. What are some of the most common things that pop up in terms of like linguistic discrimination? Because I remember I watched a Hassan Minhaj special on like affirmative action, and he basically gave the difference between like a quota and like I don't know what the other word is, but it was basically like, oh, we want to increase the population of like African Americans and like X, Y, Z major on campus versus we need 8 more black people. So like the difference between those two is like startling. What are some of the most like common things you've seen? Just from out of my own curiosity.
So I'm curious, so did you go to his show last night?
I wanted to, but I couldn't, and I was so sad. He's like the representation I've been dying for years. So like.
Okay, did anybody go see him? So Kristen, that was the show. That's what we missed. So, you know, what have I discovered from a linguistic point of view? What's interesting is that even though the linguistic profiling work began with racial implications, we soon discovered that it ensnared lots of different groups that had very little to do with race, right? So I often have my students go through the thought experiment of imagining that the United States evolved without any racial diversity, such that everyone living here is of European descent, right? So Columbus comes, there's no Native Americans, slavery never happens, the Chinese don't build the railroads. For all practical purposes, everybody is of European ancestry. You guys got it? Is there still linguistic prejudice in that country? Yeah, exactly, right, yeah, okay. And what's it based on? It's based on class, it's based on region, it's based on, so, you know, just because you're white doesn't mean you like each other, right? Okay. Right? You know, I mean, that, you know, so then add to the mix that you're a minority that, you know, speaks in a slightly different way and it gets even more complicated. But we did a series of experiments where we had men and women call for an executive vice president position in a bank. And women were routinely told the job wasn't available, whereas men were told that the job was available. Clear instance of discrimination based on sex. And then there's lots of evidence that stereotypes about sexual orientation that may be perceived through speech also get ensnared through linguistic profiling. So with respect to affirmative action, a lot of the controversy has to go with who's underrepresented in the academy and why. So California just passed some laws that you know, they weren't influenced by my slide, but I wrote a paper, the Katrina paper where the cartoon shows up was called It Ain't About Race, and it was calculating your historical hardship index. And I looked at a variety of different characteristics. For example, your education, right? We live in a society where you have a choice of sending your kid to a public school or a private school. If you pay your taxes, your local school is probably going to reflect the relative wealth or lack of wealth in your community, right? But even with that, there are some parents who have the means and made the decision that they're still going to send their child to a private school. So my youngest daughter went to Choate Rosemary Hall in Connecticut, right? There's a lot of reasons why she wanted to go there, but she ended up going to a very Tony boarding school. That's where Ivanka Trump went. Cloris Leachman went there too, you know, so, and so did Jamie Lee Curtis. So Ivanka's not the only representative there, right? But the fact of the matter is that to overcome the historical consequences for indigenous populations and enslaved populations who were denied opportunities to take advantage of the growing U.S. economy. What's fair, right? And affirmative action tries to figure out what's fair.
So most of the examples we saw today, which were both sad and cool, had to do with interpreting evidence of some form or the other. I was wondering if there were any examples where linguists helped interpret legal statutes, like laws, for instance, judges usually are the interpreters, but maybe sometimes they need help from experts.
Yep, so this is just a smattering of the cases that are looked at. So there was one case in 1979 in Ann Arbor. There was an education case where this did come up and linguists were involved in the interpretation of the law. But the true arbiter of these things tends to be the judge overseeing the case. And the judge has a tremendous amount of power. The particular case that I'm talking about is called the Black English trial. What happened was 11 plaintiffs had been bused from Detroit to Ann Arbor and were placed in an elementary school where they were misdiagnosed as abnormally developing from a linguistic point of view. But it turns out that the speech pathology diagnostic that had been given to them had been normed for standard English speakers. So when they said both, pronounced B-O-F rather than B-O-T-H, that was marked as a pathological error rather than a phonological difference, right? And there were lots of instances of that. And so they were placed in remedial education. They sued, saying that their civil rights had been violated, but the judge interpreted the law that President Nixon put in place to actually help Spanish speakers in public schools gain fluency in English as the basis of the defense. So the defense, my professor William LeBeouf was part of that defense team, Roger Shai was part of the defense team, Richard Bailey was part of the defense team, Geneva Smitherman was part of the defense team. It was quite a strong group of linguists that then told the judge that his expanded interpretation was valuable to the African American plaintiffs, and they actually won that case. But the defendant school district didn't appeal the decision, so it didn't go to the Supreme Court. It had the impact of that particular region, but there's a bilingual case, Lau versus Nichols, where in the Lau versus Nichols case, a Chinese family in San Francisco sued because their Chinese-speaking child was performing poorly in school, and the Supreme Court ruled that if a U.S. citizen shows up in a public school not speaking English, the school has to make accommodations to help that child. But in the case of what happened in Oakland with Ebonics in 1996, there was a debate where, and the proponents of Ebonics said, oh, based on some of the weird linguistic literature, my interpretation, right, that said Ebonics is not English, it's an African-based language. It's linguists didn't come up with that, okay? At any rate, they tried to argue it wasn't English, right? So that then the black students would be eligible for a bilingual education. But the fact of the matter is that the Clinton administration and Secretary of Education Richard Riley said, it's clearly a dialect of English. We don't provide bilingual education money to people that just speak a different dialect. We wouldn't do that for someone from North Carolina that moved to Oakland, so why would we do that for black kids, right? So these are all moving targets. And the only thing that I've been lucky about is I can share with you my own personal observation. When I get in a courtroom and I begin to testify, I think most of the judges that I've encountered, even though they have a great deal of power, I think that they're bored with their jobs. I think they find their jobs incredibly tedious and boring. Why? They all try the same kind of cases. How many times do they have a linguist come in their courtroom? Not very often. This works to my advantage, right? Because in the murder case that I worked on where it was I know I committed this shit, I blurted out, you used the wrong methodology. Okay, prosecutor's like, professor, you're supposed to answer my questions. You are not supposed to volunteer anything. To which I said, but don't you want to know the right? He's like, please, can you confine yourself? I said, sure, yes, I can. No problem, I can do that, right? So, so as he was, going further, I forget exactly what it was, but oh yeah, no. So he objected to a couple of the things I said, and I made some observation, and he says, I object. And the judge looked over and he said, let him talk, right? And I realized the judge was just curious to hear more about linguistics. I mean, he kind of overruled any of the legal stuff that the prosecutor wanted to do. The good thing in that particular case was, the question that the prosecutor wanted to get me with was, he said, do you have any objection to the death penalty, right? And I realized that was a gotcha question because, and so I did some quick math and I tried to think of circumstances where I'd be okay. So if someone harmed my kids, yeah, I'm okay with the death penalty, right? So I'm like, yeah, I'm fine, right? Okay. And so when he was, trying to do his gotcha questions, it was real clear to me that he was trying to undermine what I said, but the defendant was possibly going to lose his life. And the jury decided that even though they felt there was enough evidence to convict, there wasn't enough evidence to put him to death. Because right now, we've seen so many times where DNA evidence comes forward, and then it's proving that someone, isn't guilty. Well, if you've taken their life, you're done, right? There's no recourse.
Right, the power differentials in communication, because I missed that one. And I think we, in the academy, do exactly the opposite. I mean, what a power trip these jargon jousting tenure tracks, sorry, professors are on when they are trying to berate and belittle, and whether it's students or it's graduate students or, it almost becomes a, it's these are languages, it's a jargon unto itself, right? That's so we're gonna joust with this. But thinking in terms of, I love forensic linguistics, it's fascinating to me, but when I scale it back to the kind of things I'll be doing on a day-to-day basis, working with students from such a diversity of linguistic backgrounds and having them even say things to me like, they have to do an oral presentation, I really don't speak well enough to. It's like you're 10 times smarter than Mr. Perfect English Speak, who is full of fluff, right? And so, and I see how, the self-censorship, and also as a second language speaker of Spanish, who spent a lot of time in the graduate department in Spanish, God, I was terrified all the time to open my mouth, and sound stupid. And it's not helped by the behavior of our colleagues. I don't, thankfully, I know we're going to have an event, right, but I think so much needs to be done, in terms of professional development, to get that our different ways of speaking American, they're not, arbiters of our character and our intelligence. So it's really more a comment, but wanted to see that again and take a picture of it.
So,
thank you for that comment. I don't think I need to add anything to that. Everybody has their own experiences with that, right? You go back to my thought experiment where I happened to kind of glibly say, just because you're white, you don't like each other, right? So you don't necessarily like each other. So some of the power dynamics that you've talked about that have racial overtones, they can happen among power differentials among people of the same race, right? I said some very nice things about, the theoretical orientation of this department, but any theoretical linguist, you work in syntax, right? Do syntacticians disagree from time to time?
It's been known to happen.
Yeah.
Don't listen to him. He never says anything correct.
Yes. Okay. All right. Okay. So it just depends on the circumstance. What I'm sympathetic to that you're saying is for the people that feel powerless, and then worse than that, have been made to believe that they're doing something wrong, right? And that's potentially crushing. And that's where folks like, Kristen and Nicole and Diet come in. Did I do it right? I was working on that final consonant. Okay, thank you. Well, Arabic is not in my wheelhouse yet, but give me some time. I can do my assalamu alaikum, but then then I come to a screeching halt. So, are there any more questions? I'll take one or two more. Yeah, please.
Hello. So I had a thought, are there any scenarios where maybe a witness is being prepped for their trial and maybe they're being told to code switch at the trial, like when they're on testimony? Is there any value to that? Is maybe like the audible differences able to overcome like the visual differences in that sense? Or
No, I think I get what you're saying, and coaching witnesses happens. It just depends. You don't want a witness to perjure themselves, right? But if a witness can do something that enhances their case that falls short of perjury, it just depends on whether or not the attorney has the skill set to make it happen, right? So was that answering your question, or did you have more?
I think like specifically code switching, because I want to know like, I remember like seeing the video for the housing where the guy was doing different accents on the phone. Right. But if they did it physically in front of someone else or in front of a jury, they'd be more sympathetic if they could hear potentially.
Yeah. So I made it look easy, and it's not easy, right? So the ability to do that is more or less effective, and you certainly don't want to do it if you're not going to do it well, right? Because if you try the second dialect and you fall short, all kinds of bad things happen, right? This question comes up in a slightly different form in many of the educational lectures that I give, which is where it relates to part of the point that you're making, and it's the flip side when a white person is trying to be empathetic and asks me, should I, in empathy of my black students, should I try to emulate their style of speaking and sound more black? And the answer to that is no. Okay, don't go there. Why? Because it's perceived as being patronizing, right? And the dialect leveling in that direction, if it looks like it's inauthentic, isn't going to go well. And we talked a little bit about this last night. Crazy Rich Asians movie, the woman who was like extra hip, who is she? Aquafina. Okay, so Aquafina has been just trashed on Twitter for exploiting black speech, right? And the fact of the matter is, and this was the point that I made, is that, as a black person growing up, I was so used to the fact that anybody who wasn't black that was at least trying to demonstrate that they were cool, adopted some slang or used some slang that tried to show like, hey, I'm not a nerd, I know some black people, I can say some slang, I'm cool, I'm hip. Sometimes it came off as really lame, but at least they made the effort, right? And so for Aquafina, she's showing like, hey, I'm down with the black folks. And then she just got scorched earth treatment on Twitter for like, how dare you go there? You owe black people apologies. But, okay, Kristen, it's true confession times of what we've had to deal with the Linguistic Society. So the Linguistic Society now has a social media committee, right? Where stuff blows up on Twitter all of the time. And as a boomer, late to the party, it just seems to me in many instances that a lot of these things are faux complaints with people that are, trying to grab their 15 minutes of fame and see if they can get something to go viral, but the indignation strikes me as inauthentic in many instances and culturally stifling in ways that might be potentially healing. So thank you for your question, which I didn't answer, but led to another stream of consciousness. I'm going to let somebody else have a chance down here.
My question is, do you have any research or experience yourself that there are different accents that are particularly prone to being, like in the housing market, for example, discriminated against, or to some extent, is it just having an accent? I ask that because my husband, I maybe talked about some people. He has a very strong Albanian accent. But when he's on the phone, people will offer to get a Spanish interpreter for him.
Oh.
And it's pretty clear that he does not have a Spanish accent. And so I think at least there's a portion of people that hear accent they might have for other reasons. So he's low income or whatever, and then they just go there. And I was curious if you've seen any differences between types of accents.
Yep. So not part of this presentation, but some of my other research was based on controlled experiments where we did language attitude studies of someone who had German, well, first off, standard received British pronunciation. So received pronunciation is more or less the way that you talk to the members of the royal family, right? If you're gonna go see the Queen of England and you're British and grew up in England, the appropriate manner of speaking before the court is received pronunciation, is what it's called, all right? So we had a speaker of received pronunciation British English, German accented English, a speaker of Japanese, an African American speaker, a Mexican American speaker speaking English, and then a speaker who was a Chicano speaker that was a native speaker of Spanish. And we controlled the experiments so that the African American English and the Mexican American and the British had no grammatical mistakes, okay? And we introduced both grammatical and pronunciation mistakes for the German, the Japanese, and the Mexican. And then we asked people, who's intelligent, okay? Well, this will come as no surprise to anybody here. The received pronunciation from England was perceived as the most intelligent, right? Okay, because why? Because English from England is, you know, what we in America kind of speak, right? And so that was perceived, but then the German and the Japanese were seen as more intelligent, even though there were mistakes. So when we did the exit survey, we said, why did you judge people the way they did? And they said, well, we could tell that English wasn't the mother tongue for the Japanese and the Germans, but they didn't extend that benevolence to the Mexicans. Okay, the Mexicans were seen as the group with the least intelligence, right? So yes, we've seen evidence of that, and it ties into different, you know, language attitudes.
So I was actually going to ask, you brought up social media. I'm like quite the opposite. I like live on the internet. I'm terminally online. I basically live on Twitter and Tumblr and Reddit. I don't know a life without the internet, so to speak. But
you're not alone.
Yeah, that's basically most of my generation. But anyways, I wanted to ask how you think, if you can predict, how you think social media and like the presence of technology is going to advance this sort of linguistic discrimination. I'm fortunate enough to taking a class this semester on bias and discrimination, like the focus like people perception, like social cognition. And I had to write a paper on this, and it was about how we interact. Oh no. Oh,
We can hear you.
oh, okay. And how like we interact with social media and like people online actually increases like thank you, sorry. Or actually like puts us more at like risk, I guess, of like having a bias towards certain people or thinking that XYZ is less than us or like not as smart or something. I'm not really conveying my point across really right here, but how do you think, and have you seen instances of that sort of thing? Like, have you seen like linguistic discrimination online, or how do you think it'll get worse? Like, do you think the internet's more powerful tools to like sort of alleviate that, or
I get it.
like make it not as bad?
I get it. So it's an important and fair question, and one of the reasons for that is that social media, as you said, is really a new dimension of how people communicate in different countries, depending upon the platform and depending upon how it's regulated, right? So we've seen, for example, you have to do a bunch of things very badly in order to get removed from Twitter, right? So there's a threshold upon which someone says, nope, you don't get to do that anymore. But one of the things that I've been discussing with the social media committee of the Linguistic Society is whether or not it's possible to use the social media to promote kindness. And I don't see a lot of evidence of that, okay? I see what I said was the faux outrage, right? I see lots of people in a social media context trying to say things that gain attention, right? And in many instances, one of the ways to gain attention is to do something controversial, right? So everybody here is aware of the Will Smith slap. And then the debate was that staged? Was that authentic? Or was he, destroying his career on purpose because he didn't realize that people were going to push back on that, right? So it's hard to tell, right? And very often it's happening on a case-by-case basis. I think where things may go dangerously wrong, and we've seen evidence of this, is where bullying might occur with enough frequency that if younger people start taking their lives, because there's young people that are on that, you need to kill yourself, look at you, I saw your Instagram, why are you even alive, right? If that leads to people harming themselves, I think regulation will be forthcoming that's going to make it look very different. And it's also for that reason that I think that there's an opportunity among us linguists to say, hey, can't we be nice to each other? Aren't there ways to do that? And I think that's a nice place to stop. All right, thank you very much.